restaurants for lunch today, so just bear with me here. Let us open up with a word of prayer. Merciful and gracious God, you are present in rooms history forgot, in the labor of people who set the table before anyone thought to ask their name. We have spent too long blessing the meal without blessing the ones who made room for it. Open our eyes to the holy ground that we've been standing on. Ground prepared by hands we never honored. Kept by love we never named. Open our hearts and minds as we learn a new perspective. Amen. Let's actually start today by talking about Moses. Moses, the great liberator, the one who stood before Pharaoh, climbed the mountain and came down with the law. That Moses. That Moses had trouble talking. He actually begged God to send someone else because he couldn't speak very well. His exact words in our Bible say this: I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. He needed Aaron to be assigned to him, be a translator and a helper, a voice for what Moses couldn't say himself. Moses had moments where he kind of had rage and spun out of control. That happened several times. He threw the stone tablets down famously onto the ground and shattered them. He struck a rock when he was told to simply speak to it, and that unraveled and cost him the promised land. Moses followed specific patterns. He needed structure. He processed the world differently than other people around him. Now, nobody's claiming that Moses was autistic. That word never existed back then. But something happens when a person living with autism reads that description of Moses that I just gave for the very first time. They recognize it. The hero of the Exodus stops being a figure just admired from a distance. And all of a sudden, to that person living on a spectrum or someone who knows someone personally living on a spectrum, Moses becomes familiar. Someone whose way of moving through the world, that difficulty of speech, the need for a helper, the occasional meltdowns. Someone living on a spectrum, that sounds like home. That sounds like someone I can truly identify with. Now, we're not here changing the Bible in any way, shape, or form. We're simply letting people inside of it, allowing people to identify with different people in the Bible, identify in very personal and relatable ways. This month, as we all can figure out by this point in the service, is Pride Month. And this congregation has made it very clear that we are open and we are affirming. This is not a debate here in this sanctuary. It's not debating whether they're accepted because they just simply are. But there's another question we're going to be asking this week and throughout the series. One that doesn't get asked nearly enough, and the question is this: do LGBTQ plus people see themselves in the Bible in the same way someone living on the spectrum identifies with Moses in the Bible? Can the LGBTQ plus community see themselves somewhere in the Bible? Not as a warning, not as a tale, a cautionary tale, not as an unnamed sin that gets weaponized in culture wars. Do they simply see themselves as one God keeps choosing over and over again? God keeps calling. God keeps refusing to give up on. Every Sunday this month, we're going to look at a significant figure in the Bible and ask what happens when an LGBTQ plus Christian reads that story. Now, we're not going to claim anything we cannot support. We're not going to impose our modern categories on ancient people. We're simply going to notice what's already there, what scholars have already observed for decades, what LGBTQ plus people have quietly recognized for generations, often alone, often without a single person in their church willing to say it out loud. We are going to say it out loud. And today we're going to start with the upper room. We're not here to prove anything. We're just here to notice. Notice what the text already shows us. And then ask, who's always been able to find themselves in these stories in ways that we may have missed? Luke, in this story of the upper room, shows us two men who were living together, running a home together, and hosting the most sacred meal in the history of the church. Jesus tells a couple of his disciples to go into the city, and you'll find a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him. Well, in first century Jerusalem, carrying a water jar was women's work. It wasn't their preference. It was not a custom that varied from household to household. It was the hard structure of the culture of the time, where every task at that point in time carried a gender, whose boundaries were publicly enforced during that time, and crossing them was immediately visible to every person you passed. Women gathered water. Women managed the domestic sphere. That was the order of things. It wasn't subtle. A man moving through the narrow streets of Jerusalem with a water jar on his shoulders would have been noticed by everyone. Some would have laughed. Some would have looked away. Some would have made sure that they saw him. He carried his difference in public every time he made that walk. And he kept making it. Now, Jesus doesn't send his disciples to a priest, to a merchant, to a soldier, to a scribe. Jesus uses a man doing woman's work. A man whose visibility in a crowd was so distinctive, it could be used as a landmark for the disciples to follow. The disciples followed him. They followed him without hesitation. The text records no side conversation. The text records no discomfort, no pause to assess whether this is really the right person. They simply follow. And this man leads the disciples to a house. A man who didn't fit the expected shape of a man is the one God uses to show the disciples where to go. Now look what happens when they finally arrive. The room is already furnished. The table is already set. The space is already prepared before anyone even knocked at the door, before any announcement that tonight would be the night, before there was any way to know what happened in this room would be repeated by Christians for every generation since. Someone built that in that room. Someone managed that household. Someone decided that the door would always be open and the table would be ready. And here's what the text does not give us in the story: a wife, a mother, a daughter, any women at all. In first century Jewish households, the domestic sphere was women's territory. Women ran the home. Women managed the hospitality. Women set the table and prepared the food and received the guests. Now, that wasn't an insult. It's the structure of the time. The home was the woman's domain, and her authority was real and recognized. But this household had no women in it. What it had was two men. one who carries water, women's work done in public, every day, without apology, and the other one who runs the household, who owns the space, who has furnished the upper room, who receives the disciples and makes the space available. The head of this household is a man, doing what women generally did at that time. The person carrying water is a man. There's no wife. There's no one managing the domestic affairs. There's no mother receiving the guests. There's no conventional family structure here at all. There's just two men living together, keeping house together. And the text does not explain it. The text doesn't justify it. In a culture built on honor and shame, where every neighbor watching this household knew everyone's business, this arrangement would not have gone unnoticed. A household without a woman was already unusual enough. A household where a man carried the water jar in public every day was a household that invited comments. The neighbors knew. The people in the market knew. The two men who lived in the house moved through Jerusalem, seen, assessed, and discussed behind closed doors. Not in hiding. They didn't hide behind closed doors. They were out in plain sight, living their life, doing what they did, being who they were in a city that certainly had opinions about it. Now, open and affirming Christians often declare that the ancient world did not have an issue with same-sex relationships like we do today. Now, there may be some truth to that in that conversation. But the ancient world did have very clear gender roles in society. These two men were clearly gender-bending social expectations. Luke simply shows us this household and keeps writing. No footnote, no clarification, no apparent discomfort. And ancient writers knew exactly what they were including and exactly what they were leaving out. And when Luke describes this household of two men and no women and domestic roles being reversed, and then simply moving on and not making a comment, that was a writer's choice. Luke doesn't interrogate this household. He doesn't offer a clarifying note about the nature of their agreement. He doesn't pause to assure the readers everything is theologically appropriate before Jesus sits down to eat. Luke trusts these two men to prepare the table and then keeps writing. That silence is a form of honoring the situation, a refusal to make their household a problem that needs solving before this meal can be served. 2,000 years of Christian worship traces back to this room. The Last Supper, the meal that every tradition in every century has repeated, this meal happened in this private home managed by these two men. Jesus breaks bread there. He passes the cup there. He says the words that become the foundation for Christian worship in the room where the domestic order had already been unconventional. And God apparently didn't have a problem with that. The story doesn't end with that meal. After the crucifixion of Jesus, the disciples scatter. And then the disciples gather once again. Acts chapter 1, verse 13 tells us they returned to the upper room. The same room that they were just at. Think about what this means. These men had just watched their teacher executed by the state. They were afraid. They scattered. They could have gone anywhere in Jerusalem. They could have disappeared to their own homes. They could have hidden separately, let the movement quietly dissolve in grief. Instead, they went back. They went back to the house where someone had already showed them what it means to make room without being asked, to keep a table ready without requiring explanation, to keep the door open. Back to the two men. They went back to the table. They went back to the sacred spot. And then a third time, Pentecost, Acts chapter 2. The Spirit descends, the church is born at the place where these two men prepared. That same room is where Pentecost takes place. This household held the Last Supper. It held the frightened disciples after the crucifixion, and it held Pentecost. Three of the most decisive moments in the formation of the Christian faith happened inside these four walls, kept by two men, whose arrangement Luke never asked to justify. The Spirit descends where hospitality has already done the work. God doesn't wait for officially sanctioned spaces to work. God shows up where the table is already set, where the door is already opened, where someone already decides that welcome was more important than explanation. That's the pattern that shows up in these texts. And it runs straight through a household that the gospel trusted without asking questions. A chosen family. We've heard this modern term, chosen family. Chosen family is not a consolation prize. We heard Todd talking about us as our chosen family. For many people, it's the only reason why they're still alive. It's not a metaphor. It's not an overstatement. It's the literal truth of what happens when the family they were born into decided they were too much to hold, and someone else opened their door instead. Chosen family is built from something harder and more deliberate than biology. It's made from choice, repeated every day, under no obligation. The church has often treated chosen family as a lesser category for a long time, as something people might settle for when the real thing isn't available, as an agreement that might be tolerated but cannot be blessed. For many LGBTQ plus people, that teaching arrived alongside their rejection letter from their families of origin, alongside the loss of people who were supposed to love them. The church told them that their chosen family wasn't real, or their biological families were using the church's own language to justify closing its doors. The two men in the upper room are chosen family. We do not know the details of their story. We do not know how they came to share that household, or what their arrangement looked like from the inside. What we do know was what Luke gives us. Luke gives us two men, no women, no mother, no daughter. No women managing the domestic space. Luke gives us a man carrying water and a man running the household. A room that's always furnished and ready. That's the whole picture. That's what the text offers. And that's what the text offers without apology. Jesus sent his disciples to them. The frightened disciples came back the night the world broke for them. And then again, the Spirit descended on that house. The text never once asked them to prove their household was legitimate before those three powerful things happened. The institution that has spent centuries interrogating a household like theirs was born inside of a household like theirs. This is the truth that the text gives us. And as we bring this sermon to a close, I want to make sure that we notice nowhere in this sermon did we make any declaration of their relationship. No identity, no comment on sexuality. The only thing we did is state the facts as they were written in the Bible. Two men living together, each assuming traditional roles assigned to women, each enduring their relationship in a culture that had strict gender identity roles. Yet clearly these two were loved by Jesus and accepted by the disciples. When people can find someone in the Bible they can personally relate to, it makes the Bible more powerful and personal. This sermon in no way was trying to make any controversial declaration. The only point this sermon was trying to make is this: can we see why people in the LGBTQ plus community can personally identify with this specific story?